Well, I feel that life gives each and every one of us choices, and we're faced with many obstacles, losses, challenges in our life. And I certainly have had my, huge potpourri of lots of different opportunities to move through challenge and loss. And I don't think I'm any different than anybody else. Born into the world as children, as we really are victims. We don't have the power of choice. The adults around us are choosing for us, and a lot of times for many of us, the choices that the adults are making are really poor choices. And so that's what's modeled to us. But for me, in my experience, that is what happened to me as a child. And then I grew into a teenager, and I started to realize that I had choices that I could make of my own. And, based on what had been modeled to me, I started to make very similar choices to my father and mother. And I chose drugs and alcohol, and I chose inappropriate relationships, and I chose looking outside of myself for friends. And to make friends, I chose drugs. And I decided that school was too hard and painful, and I was learning challenged, so I dropped out of high school. And those were all what I describe as the part of my life where I went into a giant suck hole. I went into a huge poor me. I was the poster child of the kid from the school from Hard Knocks. Nobody liked me. I was bullied. I was ostracized, of course, because I didn't love myself. I didn't know that at that time. I thought it was because there was something wrong with me and I wasn't good enough, and that it was about everybody else. It took me well into my adult years when I finally, somehow by the grace of God, pulled myself up out of that by finding certain tools and awarenesses. It actually began when my sister Lindsay finally admitted that she was an alcoholic, and she went to AA, and she started to derive the tools from the AA process. And I started to listen and hear some of those processes, and I started to practice them myself. And then I went into the practice of yoga, and yoga really started to provide for me a foundation of understanding of who I was. And I started to really pull myself up and out of that suck hole, and started to really see that I had something more to give to the world. And not only that, when I started to when I got married and had children, it was no longer just about me anymore. I think when we're in that suck hole, we're in that downward spiral, we're so consumed with, the part of us that says, I'm not good enough, I'm a victim, nobody loves me, I'm going to go eat worms, that we're in that space. It's very difficult to find our way out of it. And that something somewhere needs to happen, and it is within ourselves. And I'm not sure I have the answer to what that is. I know I have a lot of ideas about how we can bring that to people, but something goes off. There's a switch that goes off where you finally realize that it's up to you and that you have choice, and you start to choose very differently. And there are, and when that happens, you're lifted up out of that. And I think when it becomes less about me and more about those that I'm serving, those that I'm helping, then I can really bring myself up and out. And it was my experience with that when I had children. So when I had children, it was no longer just about me anymore. It was about their livelihood. It was about their health. It was about their well-being. And so, I began to learn and to grow very differently. I started to access a different place within myself. And I started to learn by the mirrors that they gave back to me as my children. And then I was faced with a child who had very similar issues to me. And so I started to really recognize, even deeper within me, the truths that I held within myself, my own beliefs about me, by seeing them in my child, in my children. And the more I was able to take ownership for my negative labels that I had bestowed upon myself, the more I started to make those internal changes within me, the more I started to change. And as I changed, I started to experience the world around me very differently. So, I was presented 18 years ago, 19 years ago now, with a child who was just very different, and he learned very differently. He was a kinesthetic and visual learner. He was highly empathetic, highly intuitive. I see all those wonderful gifted things now, but at the time he was difficult. He didn't fit into the mainstream model, and so I was such a young mother, I didn't know what to do. And so I went along following along with, the normal standard things that you would turn to with a child who was presenting with issues and challenges. And the only tools I was really able to access for Benjamin was prescription medication and couch therapy. It was really hard to gain support from the schools for the first many, many years. By the time he was in 6th grade, I decided to pull him out of school and tried homeschooling him. So he moved on and he went into some other schools. We've somehow found ways to privately school him for a few years. And again, as I started to make the changes within myself, I started to recognize that if I changed my beliefs, that eventually the beliefs would change in my home. And I started to experience and witness that. Benjamin started to change as he got older. Certainly maturity took over, and by the time he was to be in 10th grade, he decided he wanted to come back to mainstream school and follow the legacy of his brother, who was a normal child, and then went back to mainstream. And you know, he sat alone. He was very ostracized, left out of his community from the time he came here because of his differences. You know, he had tics, he had obsessive compulsive rituals that set him apart, that made him different. He was loud. He was actually bigger than life. He was a fun kid. Something about him energetically bumped up against other kids, and not really sure what those things were, except for that that he had these rituals, and perhaps kids saw that. He also was very learning challenged, and so he was in special classes. So other than those things, to the normal human eye or other people in the community, unless they knew about his past, would not have known that there was anything wrong with Benjamin. So over the course of those 2 years, he finally started to change himself. He started to be okay with being alone at the lunchroom table. He started to learn from his mom that it's okay. You know, just be who you are. Just come inside and love yourself and know that you're enough. And as he started to do that, lo and behold, things started to change for him, and he did start to make friends. By the time he was in 11th grade, he had made a huge handful of friends and was on his way. He passed the MCAS by the grace of God. He just pulled himself again up by his own internal bootstraps, like I did when I was a kid. He'd found it within himself. He'd learned that it was, you know, that it was up to him, and that he could choose how his life was going to be. And you know, this is a kid who had been through, you know, what felt to him like being pushed back by a system his whole life, and not being supported by a system his whole life. And he, from his own internal strength, turned his whole life around and made it to be socially accepted. And on the day he chose to end his life, he got in trouble at school, and they chose to take away this kid's prom after being invited by 35 of his peers to ride in a limousine ride for his prom. And I can only imagine the impact of that on him emotionally in that moment was enough to say, I cannot move beyond this. No matter what I do, I lose. And you know, he was emotionally challenged. He'd been emotionally challenged his entire life. And I think that he is a huge mirror for us societally to really take a look at how handicapped our children are emotionally. You know, Benjamin shows us that, and we are seeing across the board so many kids who are acting impulsively in the moment. Benjamin had a medical diagnosis of being obsessive compulsive. He had a mind and a brain that locked on him. He would go into Michael Green, who wrote a book called The Explosive Child, called a vapor lock. And I feel that in that moment, when he was triggered emotionally, he was pushed back, he was told he couldn't do something that he had worked his whole life towards achieving. And I believe he brain locked in that moment, went into a vapor lock, and came home and took his own life. And you know, and I feel it's tragic on many levels. And I think that it's yet another opportunity for us to look at the choices that we are all making across the board with these children today.
So here you were, back in this moment of tragedy.
And I'm faced with choice.
Having come so far with him,
mm-hmm.
having worked so hard having been so willing to learn on your own and make different choices about how to raise this child.
That's right.
Who you obviously love dearly and were completely challenged by.
Absolutely.
At the same time. And here you are in this moment of tragedy, and what's happening for you?
When I really came to, to the realization that this is a done deal, I cannot change the past. I can only move forward, and but at the same time, I knew in that moment that I had choices, and that I could choose to pull the blanket over my head and go into a deep suck hole of depression like I did when I was a teenager, and use drugs and prescription medications. People were handing me pills the moment it happened. Take these, you'll feel better. And I said no. I said no to drugs. I said no to, I could have in that moment chosen to, and in every moment moving forward since that time, chosen to blame other people. And I'm all about accountability. I'm not about blame. I think that no one woke up on the morning that Benjamin Giovangelo chose to end his life with the intent in any way for this to happen. I think that there are many people, including myself, that need to take ownership for the role that we individually play, Benjamin included. Even with his illness, Benjamin was accountable for the choice that he made in that moment. And I don't feel that Benjamin was a victim. I feel on some level that this is a level of choice that he made. But certainly that we, each and every one of us, have accountability to the choice that we made, and we have something to learn from it. But I was faced with the choice of blaming, shaming, crawling into a deep suck hole, crawling into a place of being a victim, or moving powerfully forward. And I chose to move powerfully forward and be the change that I want to see in the world, and be a role model for what it means to move through challenge and loss in a way that serves the greater good of the whole, and not to have Benjamin's life and death be in vain. To take the tools and the awarenesses that I've learned along the way from his death and share it with others in the most powerful way that I can, and give children like Benjamin and families like mine, to the best of my ability, resources, tools, and awarenesses to support us in a new and different way. About 3 days after Benjamin's death, I was sitting in my kitchen, and I felt myself becoming very catatonic, like almost completely numb. I couldn't feel anything in my body. I felt myself going deep into a hole. It just felt like I was going into a dark place. And I remember my oldest son, my boy Michael, coming into the room, and he looked at me and he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "What do you mean, what's wrong with me? I lost my son. What do you think?" And he looked at me and he said, "And I'm still here." And again, there it was. It was the remembering that it's not just about me. And I really know that that's what lifted me out of it. In that moment, I went to bed that night and I prayed. I got on my hands and knees and I said, "God, please help me. Help me lift myself out of this. I don't want to go there. I don't want this to be about my suffering. Because if I choose to suffer and I choose to go in that hole, I bring everybody else with me." And so I chose, in that moment, it was a choice. Do I know that people who, once they've gone into that dark hole, that it's a choice to get out of it? I have no understanding of that. I don't know that. And I can't pretend that I do. All I know is that I was at the preface of that and I had a choice. And thankfully my son said the right thing in that moment and I was able to pull myself out of it. I certainly don't think I have all the answers. I just know that I can share what I've experienced and I can provide possibilities and ideas and tools and awarenesses and thought processes to help other people make better decisions for themselves. And that I can be a voice for that.